Hello there guys, we are back with our second Cold War video in our revision sequence. And today we're going to be looking at the second part of the spec, which is looking at developing tensions within the Cold War up until 1948. And really this unit can be broken down into looking at Sovietization, which is the key part of this unit. Essentially the first 60% is looking at the Sovietization of Eastern Europe, and then the kind of final 40% of the spec looks at the Truman Doctrine, the Greek Civil War, and a little bit on the Zhdanov Doctrine as well towards the end of this unit. And really when we're thinking about this unit, we need to be thinking about transition, because this really is a period of transition. It's a period of transition from an uneasy period of cooperation to almost structured rivalry between the capitalist West and the communist East. And what we're really analysing throughout this video is when mistrust almost becomes formalised or ossified into policy. Because really by the end of 1947, I would say, both sides are no longer reacting. They're actually organising against each other into a much more formalised period of Cold War. Although, of course, other historians would argue that the Cold War formally starts later, I would probably argue that in our third unit, by the time you see the Marshall Plan money beginning to flood into Eastern Europe, that's really when I would argue that the Cold War is on. There's no denying that the tensionometer is heating up throughout this unit. So let's start with a key term that we need to understand to really ground us throughout this period of history. And that key term, of course, is Sovietization. Now, this is a wonderful phrase to get into your essay, and it really helps ground us within Unit 2. So Sovietization is the process of turning a country into a Soviet satellite state and transitioning its country towards communism. So it's worth just contextualizing this, okay? If we're thinking about the phrase Sovietization, this phrase doesn't really exist prior to the mid-1940s. But obviously, as we've said, at the end of the Second World War, we have the Red Army really forcing the Wehrmacht, the Nazi forces, back across Eastern Europe. And then we have Soviet troops in lots of these different nations. So the point is, then between 1945 up until 1948, it's very easy for the Soviets to Sovietize these countries, and that basically means turning them communist, both politically, in terms of putting political communist parties in power and removing opposition, but also in terms of transitioning their economies into Marxist-Leninist states with command structures from the center and strong integration with Moscow. So just a reminder of where this sits within the wider kind of architecture of the first four units. We've got, of course, Stalin's Red Army beginning to push back Nazi forces across Eastern Europe that I just mentioned. We've got Yalta and Potsdam in 45 that comes into Unit 1. We've then got the use of the A-bomb on the 6th and 9th of August 1945, which, of course, ends the Second World War. And then we've got the Soviet consolidation of influence in Eastern Europe. This is what we're going to be looking at today in Unit 2. We've got the Iron Curtain speech that basically comes into today's unit, and the Long and Novikov telegram we'll look at as well as Common Form that comes into today, and the Truman Doctrine with the Marshall Plan coming into Unit 3, and then all these other events really come into Unit 4, events between 48 through to 49. So I've already mentioned this, obviously got my slides slightly in the wrong order, the context of the end of World War II, where really after the Battle of Stalingrad, that happens down here, really from kind of 1942 through to 43, so it's kind of late 42 into early 43, the bloodiest battle in human history. After that, what we have is the Red Army forces, Stalin's Communist Army, pushing the Wehrmacht, which is the Nazi army, back in towards Berlin. To such an extent, by March 1945, we have the Battle of Berlin, where the Soviet army arrives first in Berlin, and we have the Western forces pushing across here. That's Canada, Britain, and the United States. We then have the Battle of Berlin and Hitler's suicide, which I believe is the 25th of April, 1945. And the reason I'm telling you this long story is because it helps us frame the fact that Stalin has forces in this part of Europe. So it's going to be a lot easy for him to get his, should we say, almost tentacles into these countries' political systems and begin to Sovietize them. So let's have a look at this. So we should really know this phrase by this point, a satellite state. We should know that a satellite state is a country that is formally independent in the world, but under heavy political, economic, and military influence or control from another country. And we know that these different states were essentially Soviet satellites, really officially from kind of 1948, although it varies in each different nation, up until 1989 when they break away from communism across that hugely significant year, 1989. So let's just have a little think. I want you to think in your heads kind of why Stalin wants a buffer zone, and does he have any justification for the creation of a buffer zone in Eastern Europe? Just take kind of 5 to 10 seconds to have a think through that. Think, think, think. And hopefully you came up with these kind of answers. I want us to adopt a kind of Eastern mindset here, so almost adopt the Soviet mindset. And imagine you're a Soviet, you're born in 1890, you are 50 years old, and it's now kind of 55 years old, let's say, and you're almost in Stalin's position. This is Stalin's argument. Stalin's argument is that, well, Russia, or the USSR, has a long history of being invaded from Central Europe. Across these Central European plains, as you can see here, it's fairly flat, it's not hugely mountainous, which means that it's very easy for you to be invaded from. And this happens, of course, in the early 1800s under Emperor Napoleon of France, who decides to invade Russia from these Central European plains, okay, from obviously Western Europe, but invading eastwards into Russia. And that led to the death of a significant amount of Russian people. But not just that, also, we obviously have World War I in 1914, when after the failed Schlieffen Plan becomes kind of entrenched, and you get into this nasty period of trench warfare in and around here, where you've got the Eastern Front, and then obviously you've got the Western Front over here. Well, the point is, again, we have millions of Russians dying in the First World War. Through that war, again, invasion from Western Europe. Western Europe being here, but obviously the invasion pushing eastwards into Russia. But not only that, we then have World War II, where around 20 million Russians end up dying. They are by far the most heavily affected nation when it comes to casualties from World War II, bar maybe an argument surrounding Germany itself. And so the point remains, well, in Stalin's eyes, within the last 150 years, Russia, or the USSR, has been invaded 3 times from Central Europe. So he would say we have clear justification for the creation of a buffer zone to create satellite states that help protect our state from Western aggression. Okay, that has come in the form of France under Napoleon. That's come under the form of Germany twice in the early to mid 20th century. Now, you could plausibly argue that from a foreign policy, from a geopolitical perspective, that makes total sense, okay? And this is almost a, what should we say? Let's call it a defensive necessity as opposed to anything else, okay? I like that idea. A defensive necessity. Okay, brilliant. The second point is a kind of different worldview. So the Eastern mindset, Stalin's mindset, is very different to the West. He believes in communism, he believes in the principles of Karl Marx and the principles of Marxist-Leninism, and therefore he has a much more, should we say, utopian outset when it comes to the creation of a state. He doesn't believe in self-determination. He doesn't believe in liberal values, such as individual rights before state rights. He believes that the state is the true way to create communism. And therefore, in terms of doing that, you'd be willing to sacrifice individual lives and individual liberties in order to create this truly utopian communist state, this endpoint, this majestic kind of egalitarian communist state. So in Stalin's mind, he's thinking, well, hang on a minute, like all these different individual freedoms that these people want in these satellite states, basically stuff their freedoms. I don't care about their freedoms because the struggle for communism is more important. If we want to get to true egalitarianism, if we want to create this communist utopia, we might have to crush a few people. We might have to fiddle a few elections and rig a few elections. Who cares? It's all for the greater good in the pursuit of this communist vision. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, there are some very, very obvious downsides and trade-offs to this in this mindset, but it is one that Stalin largely buys into. And it's difficult for us to understand that because, well, we will all have kind of the Western mindset, so to speak. And then finally, the one is the percentages agreement. Just a reminder that significant swathes of Central and Eastern Europe were almost handed over to Russia, the Soviets to have more influence there in the percentages agreement. So Stalin almost uses that as a precursor, as pretext for a more formal Sovietized system of rule, should we say. Brilliant. We've gone through the why, so we've gone through the causation there. And what we're going to do now is look at our 5 different examples. Now, I want to remind you, have I got the spec up? Let me just see. Mr. Trudgeon, have you got the spec up? Please say you got the spec up. Kurt, do you have the spec up? I mean, Mr. Trudgeon, no, because I'm a muppet, but let me see if I can get it up quickly. If it loads. Okay, I don't have the spec here yet. Amazing. Right, here we go. So just a reminder, we're going to look at 5 different case studies here, different states in Eastern Europe and how they are Sovietized. But I just want to show you the part of the spec for this bit of the course. If you look at your screen here, you can see that all it actually says for this first bullet point is the Soviet Union's occupational control of Eastern and Southern Europe. That is Sovietization, but the point is it doesn't name these different examples. And that's really good because that technically means you don't need to know every example. They will obviously expect you to know the process, but these are examples by explaining the process. You don't actually need to know what happens in Bulgaria. It's technically not on the spec, but you do need to know Sovietization, which means basically, whilst you should aim to know all of this, if you are a bit sloppy with the details and you only memorize 2 or 3 of these, you are also largely fine. But think about if you're aiming for the A star or if you're aiming for a B, the differences that might be needed there. So I'm going to rush you through each one now nice and swiftly. A reminder, we do have these on flashcards that we need to be using to revise. So let's start with Poland and events in Poland. And I think Poland's really interesting in showing Soviet pragmatism. It's almost a testing ground for Stalin's tactics of Sovietization. And Stalin, Poland, if we go back to this map here, is a really key piece in the jigsaw for Stalin in terms of taking control of Central Europe because it is a fairly big state and also it has access here to the Baltic in the north, okay, up here. So, yeah, Poland can be seen as one of the testing grounds for Stalin's tactics of Sovietization. What happens? Well, basically, the Polish communists, they strengthen their links with the Polish socialists to be a stronger force in Poland. So they basically unite. And in January 1947, they become one. They merge as a party. And that is to have a stronger kind of center-left option here. Now, Stalin allows a multi-party government in the short term, showing his pragmatism, but he knew he would count the elections to ensure the result he wanted. And in the 1947 election, famously, the election was rigged, okay? And there were basically 80% of people voted for the communists, but the number was much, much, much lower than that. Now, not all communists fell into line in Poland. Gomulka supported a Polish road to socialism, and he was a key player within this larger new socialist party. He wanted to resist full Soviet control, but he was replaced by a pro-Stalinist called Boleslav Bierut in 1948. Now, this is really interesting because it's basically saying, well, you know, Stalin's going to basically tolerate diversity to an extent because he's got this merge of center-left parties, but he'd only tolerate it until it challenges Moscow's authority. The second that Gomulka is saying that he wants a Polish road to socialism, it's clear that he's going to be replaced. So it's really interesting when we actually look at this and we think about these events in Poland. Is this defensive consolidation from the Soviets, or is this actually just blatant expansionist control? I would argue for the latter, but someone with a slightly different mindset would probably argue that it's defensive consolidation here. But I think it shows Stalin's pragmatism, and I think it also shows that he's willing to get rid of someone if they are going to resist full Soviet control. Let's look at next events in Romania and Bulgaria. Just a reminder where Romania is and where Bulgaria is. So this is really in the southern part of Europe. So let's have a look at events here, okay? Now, it's worthwhile just contextualizing this. In Romania, because the Red Army presence, because there was more Red Army presence, because it's so close to the USSR, these are actually arguably states that are slightly easier to Sovietize just because of how close they are, and they share a border so closely with the USSR. What happens? Well, in Romania, the communists were popular as they were an alternative to the pre-war regime, and it made it easy for Stalin. Opposition was minimal. We already spoke about the Red Army being largely present there. Repression was needed much less than elsewhere, and overall, Romania kind of slides towards communism quite easily. Bulgaria is a bit different because Bulgaria, there actually was some opposition, and it's basically just eliminated. So what happens in Bulgaria? Well, Stalin manipulates elections, and he removes opponents. To illustrate this, the strongest opposition was the Agrarian Party. Agrarian just kind of means like land, the Farmers' Party. And it was led by a man called Petkov. And Petkov was basically faced with false made-up charges of espionage against the state, and he ends up being executed in 1947. And this execution basically removes the last credible alternative to communist rule. His party is then absorbed into the wider communist movement, and all other parties are afterwards banned, which basically happens in all these satellite states, which is interesting when we think about the kind of authoritarian nature of what Stalin wants to do by removing all other opposition, which removes the key principles of liberal democracy that we would associate in the West. They don't have that. They basically have a communist party, one communist party that rules. So those are events in Bulgaria there. Let's have a look at Hungary. So just a reminder of where Hungary is. Again, another important piece of the jigsaw here in Central Europe that Stalin wants to basically get control of. And Hungary is really interesting because it illustrates the kind of salami tactics of Stalin. Remember a kind of idea of salami, and Stalin slowly cutting away until what happens? You have no salami left. Oh, sorry, salami left. And you can use this word, okay, salami tactics. I've seen it in lots and lots of papers throughout time, and it is basically a good thing to use. So what happens here? Well, the communists use the tactic of allying with other political groups in order to challenge their opponent, which is the smallholders party, their opponent. As in other countries, opponents were elected and elections end up being rigged. But as in Poland, not all communists were loyal to Moscow and Stalin. Some formed links with the rogue Yugoslavia. So you can see slowly here how kind of Stalin wants the communists to ally with other groups. He then ends up arresting people and rigging elections. But then more and more people form links with rogue Yugoslavia. And just a reminder, Yugoslavia is kind of to the south here of Hungary. So they share a border. All these nations are Yugoslavia, the present day nations of Yugoslavia. So what then happens? Well, Stalin in 1949 decides that he's going to allow Hungarian communist leader Rak to be executed for anti-Soviet activities. And after this, basically all opposition to Moscow has disappeared. And the interesting thing with Rak's execution that I want you guys to be aware of is the fact that it acts as a warning to any communists considering independence from Moscow, which is a major link to the Hungarian uprising in 1956 and events that happen in 1956 with Imre Nagy, which is fascinating, okay, where we basically have Rákosi, we have Imre Nagy, and then we have János Kadar replacing Imre Nagy afterwards, who is a loyal Stalinist. Really fascinating. Okay, let's whip through our last few really quickly. So Czechoslovakia is probably the most nuanced case of all of these, because actually, unlike the rest of Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia was an industrialized nation and had a large unionized working class, which means that the communists were actually already popular because of the, should we say, quite socially democratic nature of Czechoslovakia anyway, which means that communism was maybe slightly more likely anyway in Yugoslavia. And actually, they had strong electoral legitimacy, the communists. They end up winning 38% of the vote in 1946 before Stalin really ramps up Sovietization. So we've got the Czech Communist Prime Minister Klement Gottwald. He was placing opposition from some politicians who were anti-communist. But Gottwald is basically able to shore up support and basically turn Czechoslovakia communist. And what he does here is he manages to present his opposition as anti-Czechoslovakian. So the opposition parties who are anti-communist, Gottwald basically says these are anti-Czechoslovakian, they're very right-wing. He actually basically says his opponents are Nazis. And then as a result of that, Gottwald is able to get more communists into government. And the less communist president at the time, who was a man called Benes, he ends up being forced to resign. And when he's forced to resign, you can basically collapse the role of the president or just put someone honorary there in the president's position who is a communist, and you basically have complete control over the nation. Because not only do you have a prime minister who's communist, you also have a president who is communist, or de facto communist anyway. So yeah, Benesh's resignation removed the last constitutional obstacle to communist control here, okay? And this is actually quite an interesting case here for how slowly communism begins to be introduced in Czechoslovakia. Okay, let's look at our last example, and with our PA hats on, our most iconic, because obviously we have lots of students who have a strong link to this region. We have lots of Kosovan students, reminder Kosovo, which is kind of just down here. And we also have some students who have Albanian heritage as well. So Tito is someone who is very, very relevant, shall we say. Now, Tito's really interesting because Yugoslavia and the story of Tito shows the limit of Soviet power, because basically he has independent wartime legitimacy, okay? Yugoslavia was firmly within the Soviet camp under its leader, Tito, but this is initially, this is at the start. By the end of this period, that is not the case, because by the end of the war, the communist movement was firmly in place, but Tito was loved as an iconic nationalist. Tito was adored. Why? Well, largely because of his service during the wartime. He was a really famous World War II general, and as a result of that, he had a sense of prestige, a sense of reverence, a sense of almost a regal nature that lots of these other leaders in Central and Eastern Europe simply do not have. Now, in 1948, Tito and Stalin massively fall out. Stalin felt like Tito was moving away from Soviet communism, and they were expelled from share organizations such as Cominform, okay, and Comecon. They're expelled from both. Now, this is the funny bit. Stalin tries to have Tito murdered 22 times, but he was unable to remove Tito. He was just too iconic in Yugoslavia. And Tito ends up accepting some American aid, some Marshall Plan money. However, he claimed his country was not a supporter of East or West in the Cold War and would remain neutral. And this is the important bit. Unlike elsewhere, Tito did not rely on the Red Army for legitimacy because of his wartime record. And it shows that the Cold War wasn't yet a kind of rigid bloc system. Cracks were already existing. And I suppose, you know, the ultimate crack here was Yugoslavia in southern Europe. But I go back to it, when we think about where Yugoslavia is, Stalin does still have a buffer zone here, which is why Stalin, whilst he would like Yugoslavia to be within the Soviet sphere of influence, it is not absolutely essential when we are thinking about it from a geopolitical lens, okay? Brilliant. Now, your job is to think about those different case studies. I'm just going to give you kind of like a few seconds now to think about them. Can you come up with the similarities and the differences? Because think about how you're going to write about this in a paragraph. You're not necessarily going to list everything that happens in Poland. You're probably going to say, another reason the Cold War started was Sovietization between 1945 to 48. And then you're going to say, to illustrate this, and you're going to give a couple of examples. So you're going to blend and manipulate evidence together. You're going to pull across your 5 or 6 examples and pick some bits out, and maybe in brackets mention some key names and dates and statistics. So just have a think, what are the key similarities? What are the key differences? And here's what you should have got. The answer is Stalin being pragmatic, because ultimately all he cares about is the buffer zone. He's quite pragmatic. He's not necessarily super dogmatic or ideological. Tito in Yugoslavia is a key difference, I think, in terms of the fact that Tito is enabled to move away from the Soviet sphere of influence. We've got rigging of elections and removal of opponents. So I would say similarity, similarity, major difference, similarity there. And those are things we could bring out in a paragraph. Oh, thank God we got through that. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind the Sovietization stuff, but it is getting a bit much at this point, okay? So what we're going to do now is look at 2 really important, influential people in the early phase of the Cold War. One, of course, is George Kennan, and one, of course, is Winston Spencer Churchill, who we know is British Prime Minister from 1940 to 45, and then again from 1951 through to 1955. And both of these 2 individuals in 1946 make major interventions within the Cold War through actually speeches or telegrams that then go on to shape foreign policy for a period of time. And I think if you wanted me to summarize the impact of these two individuals, I would say this: both these two individuals help influence American foreign policy for the next 25 years. Kennan more than Churchill, but of course Churchill is influential as well. Let's have a look. So let's look at George Kennan and the Long Telegram. Now, just a reminder, George Kennan is basically US ambassador in Moscow, and he's writing a long telegram from Moscow that is sent from Moscow to Washington to be read by US diplomats and, of course, Harry Truman, the president. And at this point, there's nothing inevitable. We look back at the Cold War. We've studied it for 45 years. We know what happens. But at this point, there's nothing necessarily inevitable about the Cold War. This is one of the first key moments saying, basically, in a nutshell, the Soviets are evil and we must be more interventionist. We can't be isolationist anymore. We must contain the spread of communism. So let's have a look at this, okay? So it's written by George Kennan, US diplomat in Moscow. He argued that the USSR was ideologically hostile to capitalism, and he claimed that Soviet policy was driven by insecurity and expansionism. The USSR respected strength, not compromise. And basically, Kennan interprets Soviet behavior as kind of ideological and deeply insecure. He argued that the USSR would probe for weakness, and that the USSR would try to Sovietize Eastern Europe, which was happening. And he basically argued that containment wasn't about rolling back communism, it was about preventing further expansion from Moscow. And therefore, it wasn't actually really that adversarial and that inflammatory. It was more about containment. So it was more of a defensive strategy as opposed to an aggressive strategy. But if you think about the Long Telegram and the policy of containment from a Soviet perspective, it kind of looks a lot more like encirclement when you think about NATO as opposed to being defensive. And that's kind of where we see the tension. So what ultimately happens here? What is our key impact? Well, the impact is it recommends the containment of Soviet expansion, and therefore it basically prophesizes and sets the policy of containment. It's the most influential moment in setting the policy of containment, which would last for the next 25 years. And that last point is perfect. It basically becomes the intellectual foundation of US Cold War policy, really up until kind of, I would say, kind of like the late 60s, 68, 69. Thank God it wasn't the year before that. That was a really bad 6-7 joke. But anyway, thank goodness. Yeah, it was a good one. Really until 68, 69, where we begin to see the policy shift towards aspects of peaceful coexistence and towards détente, when you see the first negotiations over the Vietnam War. And then you go on to see SALT I talks beginning that would obviously be signed in 1972. Cool. And here is the Long Telegram. I'm not going to read it out to you because my voice is already going, but you can pause this video and read through some of these key extracts from the Long Telegram here. Brilliant. Someone we do definitely know. Winston Spencer Churchill, key British politician, probably the most iconic British politician of the 20th century, along with Clement Attlee and Margaret Thatcher and David Lloyd George. Prime Minister from 1943 to 45, before he loses the 1945 general election to Clement Attlee, but then comes back into power in 1951, November 1951, up until 1955, again as PM. Hugely experienced when it comes to foreign policy and geopolitics, and on the 6th of March 1946, he makes a major intervention in the Cold War. He's leader of the opposition at this point, hugely respected, had a glittering career, and he decides, I am going to speak about the future of this continent, of the future of Europe. So this is what he says, okay? It's delivered in Fulton, Missouri, which is obviously in the United States of America. For any of you that want to remember that, if you guys remember Miss Kovacs, our wonderful teacher of sociology and geography, she left in the summer of 2025. She was actually from Missouri, and she always used to tell me she's been to basically the place where the Iron Curtain speech was delivered. And he basically argues that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, and he claimed that Eastern Europe was under Soviet control, and he called for a strong Anglo-American alliance, just like what existed in the war, to help combat Soviet aggression. So he publicly frames the USSR as a threat to democracy, and in his response, Stalin ends up comparing Churchill to Hitler. But what does this do? Well, the speech hardens public attitudes in both blocs, and again, it's almost this idea of Stalin prophesizing the division of East and West, okay, into these two blocks. He's prophesizing it before it's even happened. He's that experienced in foreign politics. He can see the future. He's dealt with Stalin close up, and he's warning the Americans and the Brits, we must do something here because this nation is descending into is descending with an iron curtain, dividing blocks into East and into West, okay? Yeah, I'm just thinking whether I'm going to read you the key bit from the Iron Curtain speech. Shall I do it? Yeah, let's just look at timing. We've probably got enough time in this video. Bear with me. Oh, God. Right, here we go. So I will read it out to you. So he basically says, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across this continent. And just a reminder that we've got the Baltic is in the north and Trieste, the Adriatic, is in the south. If I get a map up here, and basically what he's arguing is that from here, really, like to here, there is this Iron Curtain that's descended, which is true. It was descending. And it's a very, very interesting intervention and speech from Winston Spencer Churchill. Okay, let's move through these last few bits because we don't have an enormous amount left to do. We've just got to look at the Greek Civil War and the Truman Doctrine. So, the Greek Civil War, March 1947. Why is this important? Well, it's important for several reasons, okay? Basically, the Greek Civil War is a war between Greek monarchists and communists, okay? So, monarchists who are obviously capitalist, they are kind of right-wing, that group, and the communists that are, unsurprisingly, a left-wing group. Now, civil war erupts in Greece after the war. Basically, who's going to take control, who's going to take power over Greece, this very proud and famous nation. But Britain can't actually afford to support Greece, even though Britain had been supporting Greece as part of the percentages agreement and had had a long interest in Greece. Britain can't afford it, literally doesn't have the money, so then Truman has to step in with financial and military aid, and this is kind of the precursor to announcing containment, because Truman intervenes in this war in Eastern Europe, or Southern Europe, should we say, to prevent the spread of communism, but then it leads into that wider policy of containment when we consider the Long Telegram, the Iron Curtain speech, and also some of the reports from Clayton, William Clayton and Ackerson in the 1940s that also illustrate the depths of the economic crisis and malaise in Europe that is needed to do something about. Yeah, so that is basically why we need to know the Greek Civil War. You don't need to know loads about it, just the idea that it's basically what helps formalize the policy of containment. And on that note, there's a bit of nuance there for you that you can read through here. To add a bit more nuance to this. But then we get the Truman Doctrine in 1947, of course, and we know what the Truman Doctrine is. It says the USA would continue to support countries to remain free through economic and financial aid. The US would contain the spread of communism. It is the policy of containment. The best way to think about it is, how do you stop countries from turning communist? How do you keep capitalist countries capitalist? Well, ultimately, you give them money, okay? If they are wealthy, if they are affluent, it will basically prevent or screen out the threat from communism. And that is exactly what Harry Truman does. He globalizes American responsibility and frames the Cold War as an ideological struggle, and basically decides to turn on the spending taps, because then what happens, of course, is the Marshall Plan money begins to come in, okay? And we know what the Marshall Plan money is. We'll talk about it in a moment. But it's basically economic containment, isn't it? It aims to stabilize Western Europe and remove the appeal of communism. But it also ties, these European countries to the economies of the US. And we'll look at the Soviet response now. So what is the impact of the Truman Doctrine? It sets the policy of containment for the next 25 years, as I've already said. It leads to the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is the financial and economic manifestation of the Truman Doctrine, okay? The Truman Doctrine is the policy of containment. It's a belief, it's an ideology. But how do you get ideology to work practically? Well, you turn on the spending traps, you introduce a policy like the Marshall Plan. $13.5 billion of aid to those 16 different European nations, with Britain being the largest recipient of about $3.3 billion. Of course, we need to think about the reaction from the East, though, which is Stalin's reaction. And Stalin basically argues that, well, this begins to form two blocks. Stalin argues this is classic dollar imperialism. This is empire building from the Americans. They're doing exactly what we're doing in Eastern Europe, just worse. They are buying all these countries into an economic empire. and this is fundamentally wrong. It's greedy capitalist decadence. So Stalin responds. Stalin responds with the creation of Cominform in September 1947, which coordinates European communist parties into basically creating these kind of like command economies, these classic communist economies, but it allows them to integrate and trade within them, trade different goods. And this helps basically tighten Soviet control and begin to exactly integrate these different countries here accordingly in Eastern Europe. And the key link to this, when we think about it, is the Zdanov Doctrine. So with the creation of Cominform, we get Zdanov, who is a key Soviet diplomat and intellectual, basically arguing from the Soviet perspective that the world is now divided into two camps, the US-led imperialist camp and the USSR-led democratic camp. And this justifies hardening Soviet policy because there is going to be this inevitable ideological conflict. And in his mind, the Soviets are in the right. And the interesting thing here is Zdanov basically argues for the dominance of culture. And this is where you see the kind of cultural hardening within the USSR of celebrating communist ideas, demonizing capitalist ideas. And actually a lot of that is influenced by this man, Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian Marxist, really famous Italian Marxist. And the way in which Gramsci deviates from Marx and Engels, the traditional kind of forefathers of communism, is because he's obsessed with culture. He argues that basically capitalist nations dominate culture, and if we want a true kind of communist revolution, if we want to move towards communism, what we really need is egalitarian communist ideas to begin to dominate culture. And that's what they begin to do in the Soviet Union. You begin to see much more of a focus on demonizing capitalist ideology, symbolism, culture, and celebrating egalitarian Marxist-inspired communist culture that begins to proliferate within the USSR and those Eastern European satellite states. Oh, we made it, thank God. Sorry, I had to rush through that last bit because I've got somewhere to go in 5 minutes, so if I've been speaking more quickly, I apologise. Let's summarise. Unit 2, why did tensions escalate between this period in time? 1, the Soviet consolidation of Eastern Europe, the increased Western fears of expansionism, and that process of Sovietization in Eastern Europe with Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, and Hungary, I think I've already said. Kennan's Long Telegram and Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, they frame the USSR as ideological and aggressive. Our brilliant summary slide here. The Truman Doctrine, which of course formalizes US policy of containment in 1947, and then we get the Marshall Plan money coming in 1948, that $13.5 billion that goes to 16 different European nations, Britain being the highest recipient of $3.3 billion worth of aid. And then finally, the beginnings of these two blocks beginning to form with the Marshall Plan and Cominform, and eventually Comecon. We've got Europe beginning to be divided into two opposing blocks. And I suppose that by the end of Unit 4, after the first Berlin crisis and the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift, we would have that formal ossification of two blocks with the military alignments being created of course, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Warsaw Pact through the military, what are we going to say? I've lost myself. Through the military integration of those Eastern European communist countries headed by the USSR. Thank you for that video. That was thrilling. All the best. Happy revising.